Alright, the Dark Souls series has a fair bit of connections between them, but none of that even compares to the amount of connections Dark Souls has to Berserk. One of the more prominent ones involves the Taurus demon, who shares more than just a few similar traits to Zod. Although an even more apparent connection involves one of Dark Souls' most iconic characters. And Andre the Blacksmith is clearly inspired by Gato. They're both muscular elderly blacksmiths that can craft anything, and it's surprising that a character of this significance is inspired from Berserk. I mean, it's pretty cool. But at least for that reference, they changed the name. Unlike Rickert, who's, well, based off of Rickert, they don't even try to hide this one. I mean, they're both blacksmiths, and even their designs are similar. But the inspiration didn't end there, and even the unreleased Elden Ring has some of the more obvious references. The massive golden trees seen throughout the map have been inspired from the World Spiral Tree in Berserk. Along with that, the Valkyrie has a helmet that's just a little too similar to Farnese's. Although if this is considered similar, then some of these Dark Souls bosses are nearly identical. And the Nameless King's fluff of hair as well as detailed armor reminds me a lot of King Geiserik. As well as that, the hidden eyes do feel very inspired. There's also the Moonlight Butterfly who's paying homage to Rosine, Pinwheel who shares a similar shape as well as face design to the deific image, and well of course, why not have the promotional art for DS1's DLC be the exact pose from volume 28 of Berserk? Although the less flashy, but in my opinion more interesting parts, are the mechanics that were inspired from the manga. If you don't know, Guts faces against a larger but stronger beetle and a smaller although quicker mantis, and throughout this fight he struggles to deal with the speed of the mantis and avoid the hard-hitting attacks of the beetle. But if you don't already know, this style of fighting was made into the Orenstein and Smough battle. I mean, even their designs are similar. But while we're on the topic of bosses, there's still many I haven't mentioned, and the Great Goat was at least a reference for the Capra Demon, the Count's Mouth Centipede definitely inspired the True Monk's second phase, and along with that, the Gael fight has some clear parallels to Berserk. And just like the Artorias DLC, this image of Gael and the Painter feels fairly reminiscent of this scene. Although many believe that this entire fight is an homage to Guts, from character design to actual attacks. I mean, Gael even uses one of Guts' weapons. During the third phase, he utilizes a repeating crossbow which fires a flurry of arrows towards you. And what do you know? Guts uses a repeating crossbow that, well, fires a flurry of arrows towards his target. But adding a weapon that only feels kind of familiar wasn't enough, and why not just put his sword into the game? In Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3, you can acquire these great swords which feel all the too similar to Guts's. Now it could just be coincidence, but from what we've seen earlier, that's likely not the case. Although if I were to place one connection that is a guaranteed reference, it's Solvin's Beast, which in-game looks very similar to the Beast of Darkness, although that's nothing when you compare it to the concept art which is a one-to-one copy from the manga. And with this information, we can include the Watchdog boss, since all three characters basically have the same design. But as mentioned earlier with the greatswords, many weapons as well as items were inspired by the manga. One of them which makes a lot of sense is the Logarius wheel. I mean, who just thinks to make a wheel a weapon? But one of the disciples, just like Bloodborne, uses a wheel as a weapon. And this group of characters must have had a large influence on Miyazaki, since this one chapter holds some of the most connections. In the Dark Souls game files, you can find an unused weapon that is exactly the same to the one we see being used by a disciple. Although it might have been a little too alike since it was changed to the less flashy catchpole. But going back to the character panel, and these three disciples might feel reminiscent of a certain NPC. And the character Grey Rat wears the same oversized hat with the similar eye holes, which also means that the Hollow Slaves are undoubtedly based off of this character. But we're still not done, and we see them wielding two-man handsaws, which is the same weapon that the Hollow Manservant uses. Back to the panel, and as we move up, it reveals the leader of these disciples, who's called Mozgus, and with such an iconic character, how could you not add him into the game? Although it's of course only inspired, but the Evangelist shares a similar face as well as hat to Mozgus. There's also the religious presence in both characters, although the most clear connection is their ability to strike with a book. I mean, this attack is right out of the manga. And already that's around 6 connections from this chapter, but there's still more. And as you scroll down, we see these wheels being used to create some questionable house decorations, but the same design is present around the undead settlement, which throughout the area has the mangled wheel people. And while we're on the topic of wheel people, which is kind of a weird one, They come back for revenge, spinning at a dangerously fast speed, which in no doubt is just like our wheel skeletons. Also, the attacks shown in the manga are almost identical to the ones we've seen in game. But this is just scratching the surface of inspired enemies, and it seems that only 30 seconds into Dark Souls 3, you'll find a fairly blatant connection. When you come across the Ravenous Crystal Lizard, his design might feel familiar, and odds are it's inspired by Grunbeld, who both share the protruding crystals as well as lizard-like bodies. But one of my favorites are the weird squishy celestial babies in the Upper Cathedral Ward, who, yeah you guessed it, are inspired by the Demon Child in Berserk. Although many believe that the Plague Babies are inspired by the Demon Child, and the way I see it is they both are. Certain angles look a lot like the Celestial Babies, while others lean more towards the Plague Baby. And having two enemies be inspired doesn't seem too ridiculous. But within the same panel, there's another connection, and the symbol seen on this tongue is called the Brand of Sacrifice. And if you just erase these two lines and cut a little off the bottom, you have the Hunter's Mark, which is the symbol of Bloodborne. And while we're on the topic of Bloodborne, my favorite part happens to be inspired from a certain manga. The messengers, who are really just the pot boys of Bloodborne, look strikingly similar to the ones seen in the manga. There's also the Brain of Mensis, which could be referencing the sea god, although it might just be a coincidence in design. And there's plenty of enemies where it could be a coincidence over a reference, but I still think they're worth bringing up. And the Man Serpent does look similar to the Snake Lord. The Great Feline shares the wide toothy mouth to the Monster Tiger, as well as the amalgamation of body parts that is the Karthus Sandworm, who is very similar to the human Demon Worm. Another reference is the Outrider Knight and Berserker Armor, which both look oddly similar in design. As well as that, the NPC Archdeacon McDonald looks almost identical to the Count. I mean, both their body type and face shape are very similar. There's also the Hunter set, which looks a lot like the clothing that Irvine wears. But many people also believe that Siegmeyer is inspired from Bazuso, which I can see the similarities, but I think the more likely option is Horus the Hushed, who shares the round armor as well as distinct eye holes. But like most things, this could just be a coincidence, such as the Black Witch set and Schierke's clothing, which are both similar in color and of course look like witches. Although there's an armor set that I'm very confident in its connection. A character in Berserk who goes by the title of Skull Knight should look fairly familiar since they didn't change much through production. But if you don't already know, this character inspired the Dark Wraith who manages to show up in almost every single one of my videos. But if you compare the two characters, their armor as well as overall design is nearly identical. But to finish off the list of enemies, in Demon Souls you'll come across a ball of humans called the Prisoner Horde. And Guts faces a very similar foe who is also a ball of humans. And while we're on the topic of Demon Souls, while exploring the Tower of Latria, this Iron Maiden shares an almost identical design to the ones used in Berserk. Although these both could be referencing actual Iron Maidens who have designs similar to the ones we've seen. And finally, the Winged Knight's strong nose as well as thin eyes were likely inspired by Zondark's armor. Also, one I'm on the edge about is Zondark's slug demon form, which could be the inspiration behind the Pus of Man or possibly Gundir's second phase, although at this point I can't tell what's a coincidence or not. But let's move on to one of the items, and the Red Eye Orb is more likely a reference over an influence, but if you compare its design to the Behelit, they are almost identical besides the orb lacking some facial features. Now earlier we saw the Berserker armor, and there's actually another one of Guts' sets that appears in-game. And the Golden Age armor is the Baldur armor. They both share the red cape as well as thick iron chestplate, with the only difference being the lack of pants. Now we haven't talked too much about Sekiro, but there are still many connections, and both Guts and Wolf have a prosthetic arm that also functions as a weapon, with Guts having a hand cannon and Wolf having a very similar flame vent. Another attack in the game is the Makiri counter, where you step on your opponent's sword, and this is seen throughout Berserk, so the move does seem at least inspired. Also on a side note, one of the more apparent connections is the white streak that both characters share in their hair. And there's actually many parallels between these two characters, with them both being abandoned as a child and then taken in by a mentor who trains them. As well as that, the two of them do lose their arm, which is then replaced and weaponized. I mean, some of these connections are right on the mark. Now, one detail that I haven't heard too much about is this panel, which reveals these thin stone pillars surrounded by flying dragons, and this scene is likely what inspired the Dragon Aerie, with them both having an almost identical design. Another environmental connection involves the Dark Sign, which is the staple of Dark Souls 3 and honestly one of its coolest parts. But it goes without saying, and within Berserk, the Eclipse has a major role in the story. But wow, there's a lot of connections. I mean, look at the amount in the Undead Settlement. And it's funny to think that the Dark Souls sequels have less connections in a story that's completely unrelated. But if I missed any details or got anything wrong, I'd love to know, and I appreciate you watching up until this point. Have a good one.